I'm back to talk at ya. Second video. Woo! Okay. I figured for the second video, it's a really good idea for me to start to define a couple of concepts that I feel are usually missing from the discussions of vocal pedagogy, but I think are very important to get clear in terms of when we're talking about something about voice science versus how people experience singing or how people sense it in their body. And that is the difference between sensation and perception, okay? Sensation is what your sensory nervous system does all the time, every day. It's your basic touch, smell, hear, there's proprioceptive sense in terms of where you are in space. Like, I know my arm is out there even if I can't see it. That's part of proprioception. Sensation, when scientists speak of sensation, they're talking about the actual experiencing of the physical phenomena that are occurring either in your body or outside your body, in your external environment, okay? So when you're hearing something, it's the physical sound waves that are actually getting into your inner ear and then being sent up the brainstem to be recognized as some kind of sound. Perception is essentially what happens after that sensation reaches the brain or reaches higher levels and gets processed a bit. So your sensory nervous system is taking in all this information, and then those nerves, the neurons, the sensory neurons, they're going to travel up to other neurons that are then going to travel up to other neurons possibly and up into the brain and other areas of the brain, and it just all kind of branches out from there, and it gets really, really dense. So there's a few ways that your nervous system handles the fact that essentially the number of neurons that are up here, they're going to do different tasks. They're not quite the same as the number of neurons down here in your limbs and the rest of your body. So for sensation, it's going to essentially, it's going to integrate a lot of information as it travels up. And it does that a couple different ways. It can do that through summing of, the timing of when things, when certain sensory neurons got activated, essentially. It can also do that, just by different ways of essentially summing information from maybe multiple sensory neurons. So, for example, you could have a single sensory neuron that as it goes up to the next neuron, it attaches there, but then there's another one that attaches there. So you have two sensory neurons coming into the same upper neuron that then goes up further from there. Or you could have two sensory neurons completely separate from each other that then converge on the same higher level neuron before it travels up, okay? So why does it do this? Part of it we think is, kind of a space issue. You only have so much room in your body. But also it allows for a lot of computation of the signals as it goes up. So there's like a signal to noise thing, right? You can your brain gets, hopefully the idea is anyway, the theory is the brain is essentially getting the important stuff instead of the less important, maybe more constant, just kind of there stuff, okay? So from the point where, let's say, I touch my finger here and I can feel it even if I can't see it. Okay. So from the point where I touch my finger to the point where I actually perceive that this got touched, there's a bit of a delay there, but the perception is the resulting effect of my nervous system's summary of all that incoming, everything I stimulated by doing this, essentially, every neuron that got activated by me doing this. That's all going to sum in a slightly different way. And then, there will probably be memory centers and stuff that gets activated as well, so that my brain could recognize that this is a fingernail touching my finger and not a nail or not something soft like velvet, right? Like there's going to be, I'm going to perceive what's actually happening, right, to some extent. The reason I think this is important to understand the difference of for singers, because you might be thinking, what the heck? Why does that matter? What I think what it really matters for is that perception is always individual. The way your nervous system is going to sum this information and the memories you have, the experiences you have in life that are going to influence how your brain reacts to that incoming, or the way it kind of maps it to give it a name, to give it a label, right? To say, yeah, that's a fingernail, not, something else, right? That is going to be different for a lot of different people. So perception in that sense is never wrong. It's never right either, actually. But it's, it's not the real physical stuff, right? So, the actual physical sound waves that are coming out of your computer, out of your speaker from my voice, and hitting your ear right now is probably a little different than your perception of those sound waves, essentially. The way you're going to interpret the sound, the speech sounds you hear, the words you understand, the vocal qualities you would label, they might be different from person to person, possibly, right? And that does include actually even language understanding. I know that might seem funny, but if you're not a native English speaker, or if I'm talking a little fast for you, because I do tend to do that, you might perceive me saying a word that I didn't say. There's also a chance that I say the wrong thing, but that's a different issue. I do tend to do that. I get my words jumbled sometimes, so forgive me. So yeah, so those are two different things. And here's what I think is one of the bigger distinctions in vocal pedagogy versus like medical science and voice science, and like where those fields are right now, okay? A lot of times in vocal pedagogy, there's a lot of terms that have a lot to do with how people perceive the physical act of singing, which makes a lot of sense. Because when you think about back in the 18th century, back in the bel canto area, back in where, we started to train the voice to do these incredibly athletic things, they didn't really have, like MRIs or, they didn't have all this research equipment and electrodes and things like that where we could actually just see what's actually happening. They didn't have cameras to put down people's throats and take a look at vocal folds, right? They didn't have a way to measure exactly what's happening to the rib cage when you breathe, for example. But what they did have is what the teachers saw their students doing, which is a perception. It's your visual perception of what you think they're doing, what it looks like they're doing. And you had these singers' personal experiences of what they feel they're doing, right? You had the singer who said, well, I feel like my rib cage is doing this. I feel like my throat feels like this. The sound sounds like this in my head, right? Like you have those different things happening back then. So a lot of that writing is couched in, or at least when I read it, I tend to think of it as really relating much more to the perceptions of the people at the time, which does have some universality to it. I mean, there's common perceptions across a lot of singers, right? And definitely across a lot of teachers in terms of what they hear, what they perceive, what they feel is the important thing in the sound, right, for professional singing. So there is commonality, but it might not be what's actually physically happening in the real world within that person's body. The actual way they're coordinating the muscles, the actual sound waves they're putting out, like that stuff might be a little different than what we perceive. Hoping this is starting to make a little bit of sense. So there's a difference between real world output and what you think somebody's doing, or even what you think you yourself are doing, okay? And that's important because where a lot of voice science is and where a lot of medicine is we kind of want to know what's actually happening. Because if we're going to do a treatment, if someone's going to develop a drug or a surgical technique or, maybe even a behavioral treatment, we want to know how the body physically responds to that. Like, what's the likelihood that this is going to hurt the person worse than the current state they're in, right? Because that's a really important thing. If the treatment's going to be worse or going to make them worse or not going to be as good as current treatment, why even do it, right? It's not worth it. So, the question of what's really happening is important for the treatment of disorders and injuries and diseases, but it becomes, I would argue, it becomes a little less important when you're talking about an otherwise healthy body that's learning how to do something at a advanced level, right? So little less important if you're just trying to, train to run a 10K, right? Exactly what's happening in your body when you run. What's more important is you're not injuring yourself. Hopefully your form is good enough. You're not hurting yourself, and you're going to be able to train and get to your 10K. You have a personal trainer on your side to kind of help you out with that, right? Hopefully, or somebody to help you out and make sure you're not hurting yourself. But, probably overall less important to you to know exactly what's happening in your legs and your limbs and your breathing and all of that stuff while you're running, right? So I think a lot of singers feel that way about voice science. They feel like, big deal, like, why do I need to know this, like, I can sing already, like, what does it matter? I think it does actually help. I know for myself as a teacher, it gives me more confidence when I feel like I have a bit more scientific knowledge and more of a sense of what probably is actually happening based off of science versus what I think is happening or what the student thinks is happening. It just helps me to parse out, it helps me to sort of translate what they tell me they perceive into something that might actually explain what I experienced as the teacher. Like if there's a gap there, because sometimes there's a gap, but it helps me to bridge that gap a little more. Like the student says, well, I thought I took a really big breath, and I said, well, I didn't really see much of a breath happening. Then it's like, okay, maybe what's actually happening is this. Maybe they perceived this as breath versus what I saw, So it's things like that where I think it helps with pedagogy and helps with teaching. But singers who say, like, us figured out how to sing without knowing how my body's actually doing it, they're absolutely right. They did. And for centuries, people did. They figured out how to sing, even though they didn't know exactly what their vocal folds were doing and exactly what muscle was moving them. Like, they didn't know all that stuff, and they didn't really need to, right? Because sometimes athletes don't have to know what the physical therapist knows. They just have to kind of have enough knowledge not to hurt themselves. They just have to sort of follow form, figure it out, not hurt themselves, right? Ideally. So that's why I talk about what's actually happening, or what your sensory system's actually sending to your brain, and the actual motor output, the actual movement output of your body. That's something a little different than what people tend to discuss when they think what's happening, right? When you think you know exactly what's happening in your body. And that's also where you get books like Great Singers on Great Singing, where you get all these really great singers clearly knowing what they're doing, but when they try to talk about it in this, like, holistic, like, unifying, like, this is what everybody should be thinking kind of way, it starts to fall apart a little, because they all say something different, right? Their perception's all a little different. The way someone perceives the singer's formant or the buzz is different than the other person, and it gets really confusing and muddy for people studying pedagogy to read about all these different perspectives. But if you couch it under perception, that is that person's perception of how they sing. That is their personal experience, their memory, how their brain encodes the information of singing to them. Then it makes a little more sense, because then you go, oh, okay, so that's how they do it. Some of what they think might work for you, some of what they think might not, and you might need a different person to help you perceive it, help work with your perception such that you can get the right output. You know what I mean? Yeah, so hopefully this is helpful to someone out there. Sensation and perception, they are different things, and you can definitely look that up. You can Google that, and there are plenty of things on Wikipedia about sensation and perception, so if you want to continue studying a little bit of it, you can definitely go there. You could go to, NIH in the United States, the National Institutes of Health. They have a website where you can often find a lot of free scientific articles nowadays that might deal with sensation and perception in different areas of life. So you can also go there. Good resources for you. So I will see you next time. Bye!